On the 10th of October, 1886, Ira Strunk left New Albany, Indiana, with her 2 young daughters and her widowed mother, and she never came back. 11 weeks earlier, her husband had shot the choir director of her church on a public street at midday, in front of witnesses, and the evening before she left, a jury had taken 15 minutes to send him home a free man. She had not been charged with anything, then or ever. Of the 95 witnesses heard in that courtroom over 8 days, most had come to speak about her. New Albany was a prosperous river town on the Ohio, directly across the water from Louisville. The girls were 9 and 7. Their grandmother, Jane Sullivan, was a widow who had kept a grocery in the town with her husband, and the house the 4 of them had shared stood at the corner of 5th and East Main. They were going east to the small Pennsylvania town where Myra had been born 35 years earlier. Nobody wrote down what they took with them or who saw them go. 10 months before that morning, in December of 1885, Ira Strunk had come home from one of his business trips to Florida. A friend met him and put a newspaper in his hands and told him there was a paragraph in it he ought to read. He had not seen it. Almost everyone else in New Albany had. The item ran in the gossip column of the local paper, and it was short. It hinted at a questionable intimacy between an unmarried gentleman and a prominent married woman. It gave no names at all. It did not need to. That was the whole design of a column like that one in a town of that size. The editor printed a shape, and the reader supplied the contents, and the reader in New Albany could do it without effort, because the reader in New Albany already knew. The affair between Charles Hoover and Myra Strunk, whatever it actually was, had been common talk in the town for some time. Her husband was the one man in the city who could not decode a paragraph written for people who already knew. That paragraph does not survive. Nearly everything else in this story does, because New Albany printed its own trial and bound it into a book before the year was out. Sorting what a record like that keeps from what it quietly drops is most of the work here. Subscribe, and we will keep at it. Strunk read it that day. Then he went looking for the man who had printed it. Strunk went to the newspaper office. He arrived angry, and what he wanted was an accounting for a paragraph that had not named his wife. The editor's first point was a technical one. Nobody had been named. The item was actionable by no one, and the office had been careful about that. Then he told Strunk the rest of it directly, without the shape and without the softening. In Strunk's absences, Charles Hoover had been at his house. Hoover had given proofs of an undue intimacy with Myra, in company and in private, and had not been especially careful about who saw. Strunk left the office and began asking. He asked friends, business acquaintances, men he had known for a decade in a town where he had run the business college for most of his adult life. Not one of them was surprised by the question. Every person he put it to already knew the answer and had known it for months and had said nothing to him. The man they all knew about was Charles V. Hoover. He was 38 and unmarried. His father, Dr. Charles L. Hoover, ran a wholesale drug house at the corner of State and Main, and Charles worked for him, traveling for the business and clerking behind the counter when he was in town. He directed the choir at the Episcopal Church. He had been a regular guest at the Strunk house for years, received there by Ira Strunk as a trusted friend, and the friendship went back further than the marriage did because the Hoovers and the Sullivans had been neighbors in New Albany before Strunk ever arrived in it. Later, under oath, 10 of his neighbors would swear that Hoover waved at the Strunk house as he passed it and blew kisses toward the windows, in daylight, on a residential street where the Strunks had lived since their marriage. None of them had mentioned it to the man who lived there. Myra Sullivan had been an only child. Her parents kept a successful grocery. They spent money on her music, and she had the best training available in that part of Indiana in the 1870s. She had not been short of attention as a young woman and of the wedding to the head of the business college, one account said that never did a youthful pair seem happier, nor the future more inviting. Their first daughter was born in 1877 and the second in 1879. She was the organist at the Episcopal Church. Between the organ bench and the choir stalls, that building was the one place in New Albany where she and Charles Hoover were expected to be together at set hours by arrangement of the church itself. The trial record describes Hoover as pleasing in address and attractive in appearance. That single line is nearly everything the record has to say about the man who was killed, and it was written down by people arguing that he had deserved it. Mr. and Mrs. John T. Steele lived on the lot beside the church. One evening they saw Charles Hoover come up to the church and go in through a window. A short time afterward, they saw Mrs. Strunk come up the same street and go in at the front door. What they noticed, and what they were still able to describe 9 months later, was the quiet. The organ was not touched that evening. No hymn was practiced, no scale was run, nothing came out of the building at all for the length of time the two of them were inside it. 3 days before Christmas of 1885, Ira Strunk left the house at 5th and East Main and took rooms at the Occidental Hotel at the corner of 1st and Main. He had come to New Albany out of the University of Kentucky in his 20s and built a business college out of nothing, and by 1885 he was an officer of a building and loan association, a worker for the Republican County Committee, and a promoter of the Odd Fellows Lodge. He taught penmanship. Within a few weeks of moving into the hotel, he had sold his interest in the college. Myra stayed where she was, in her mother's house with the 2 girls. The Occidental stood 4 blocks west of it, on the same street. For the 10 months that followed, husband and wife lived in the same town, along the same thoroughfare, and nothing in the case records a word passing between them again. Then he got sick. The doctors of the day called it an inflammation of the bowels and a malarial fever, and it kept him in bed at the hotel through the winter and most of the spring. Visitors came. Some of them brought him more of the town's talk. He did not get up until the end of April. The first thing he did with his recovery was go shopping. Meyenthal's clothing store stood at the corner of Pearl and Market, and on a weekday afternoon at the end of April, 1886, Ira Strunk walked into it and found Charles Hoover already inside. They saw each other across the counters, and Strunk drew a revolver and fired. The pistol misfired. Hoover went out through the cellar and got away into the street, and Strunk was left standing in a clothing store with a gun that had failed him. The Hoovers pressed charges. A grand jury indicted Strunk for assault and battery with intent to kill, and he was arrested, and he raised bail without any difficulty at all in a town that knew exactly what the charge was about. Then he left for Florida to sell his property there. The state of Indiana had a man under indictment for trying to shoot Charles Hoover, and it let him go. That indictment was never tried. 3 months later, the state got the same 2 men back in the same relation to each other, on a wider street, with a pistol that worked. Charles Hoover and his father walked home for lunch. On the days Charles was not on the road for the drug house, the 2 of them left State and Main a little before noon and went up Market Street to the family house, and they did it often enough that a fair part of the town could have said so. The 27th of July, 1886, was hot. Ira Strunk had been back from Florida for several weeks. That morning he had taken his daughters out walking, and at about 11:30, he was sitting in one of the chairs set out on the sidewalk in front of a hotel on Market Street, the way men sat out in front of hotels in July. The Hoovers came past him. Strunk stood up out of the chair and followed them. He kept behind them for 2 blocks. Then he closed the distance, and he shot the father twice, and Dr. Hoover went down on the pavement. Charles Hoover ran for the door of Bowles' barber shop. He was shot twice before he reached it. He fell in the doorway, and Strunk came up over him with the butt of the revolver. and kept at it until a man on the sidewalk got hold of him, pulled him off, and told him Hoover was dead. Strunk lifted his hat and wiped the perspiration off his face. He put the pistol back in his coat pocket. Then he walked back down Market Street to his hotel, and he was arrested there within the hour. Dr. Hoover was carried off the pavement alive. Whether he recovered from the 2 shots and how long he outlived his son is unknown. 3 separate accounts place the chair Strunk had been sitting in at 3 different points on that street. The one thing all of them agree on is the walking. 2 blocks in the open at midday behind 2 men going home to eat. Strunk spent 73 days in the Floyd County Jail waiting for his trial, and in that time, about 1,500 people came to see him. Former students wrote from all over the country, men who had gone through his bookkeeping classes and were doing well now, and they wrote to say they were with him. The visits were not a secret and were not meant to be one. They were counted, and the count was printed. Ira Strunk was in New Albany for all 73 of those days, in her mother's house, in the town that was queuing at the jail. The men who came to see him were tallied to the nearest 100. Of her that autumn there survives nothing at all, not a visit, not an errand, not a line in a paper, until the day she was called to the stand. His attorneys entered the special plea the Indiana statute required, in writing, at the arraignment, unsoundness of mind at the time of the commission of the alleged offense. That was filed before the grand jury had done anything at all. On the 8th of September, the grand jury returned its indictment. The language was the standard language, and it ran to a single sentence of some length, and it said that Ira G. Strunk had killed Charles V. Hoover feloniously, purposely, and with premeditated malice, with a pistol loaded with gunpowder and leaden bullets. The charge was murder in the first degree. 6 lawyers appeared for the state. Frank B. Burke was the prosecuting attorney. Jacob Herter was his deputy, and 4 more members of the New Albany Bar came in to assist, including a colonel and a major, both local men. The state of Indiana put 6 attorneys into a courtroom in a town that had spent the summer standing in line to shake the defendant's hand. The trial opened on the 2nd of October and ran for 8 days. Admission was free, and seats went to whoever got there first, so there was a crowd at the doors every morning, men and women both, pushing for the benches. When the state put on its witnesses, the gallery hissed them. The prosecution needed 1 day. Nobody disputed that Ira Strunk had shot Charles Hoover on Market Street at midday, and the state proved it and sat down. That left 7 days, and the 7 days were about Myra. More than a dozen witnesses came in with what they knew about Hoover's relations with her. 10 neighbors described the kisses blown at her windows. 8 more had seen the 2 of them walking together or meeting at the church on ordinary weekday afternoons when there was no service and no rehearsal on the calendar. The Steeles gave their evening, the window and the front door and the silence. The other half of the defense concerned Ira Strunk himself. Witnesses described a man who had stopped being able to teach, who made errors in front of his classes, and then gave the classes up, who sat at a window for hours, who walked past friends on the street without knowing them. In the building and loan books, there was a posting error of $1,500 made by a man who taught bookkeeping for a living. Dr. W.B. Fletcher, superintendent of the Indiana Hospital for the Insane, testified at length and gave the defense the 2 words it needed. He found Strunk undoubtedly insane. A second physician, Dr. Barnes, agreed with him. Through all 8 days, Myra Strunk had no attorney in that room. She was not a party to the case. She had no standing to object to a word of it, and there was no charge against her that she could answer, because a woman's conduct was not an offense in Indiana and never had been. Legally, every hour of it was about her husband. What Shepard had sworn to was this: he was on the lot next to the church, nearly opposite a rear door, and through that door he saw Mrs. Strunk in the small vestibule fastening her clothing. Charles Hoover was in there with her, without his coat or his vest, one suspender down. In the course of the following week, from the same porch, he saw the two of them lying close together in the same part of the building, and what he understood by it he told the court, and the court took it down, and the printer would not print it. They were inside between a quarter and half an hour. She went in first. Hoover came shortly after. It was the only evidence in the case of anything physical between them. Everything else was kisses from a sidewalk, walks, weekday hours, an evening with no music. Shepard alone said he had seen. The prosecutor took him back over the ground. Where exactly he had stood, what lay between that spot and the rear door, how much of a small vestibule a man could really take in from the next lot over. In front of the jury it came apart. Nothing of the kind could have been seen from where Shepard said he had been standing, and the two men got heated enough over it that they came close to blows in open court. The defense did not put up another witness to the same thing, because there was not another witness to the same thing. So the only direct evidence of anything between Charles Hoover and Myra Strunk came down to a man on a porch, and the man on the porch had been broken on a question of sightlines. After that day, James Shepard disappears from the case. The question he claimed to answer has stayed open ever since. She came in wearing a plain suit, with her face veiled, and she was the last witness called in the trial. The gallery had been fighting for those benches since the 2nd of October. Every one of them knew who she was, because most of them had known before her husband did. For 8 days that room had been full of her. She had been described from 10 different windows, followed up the street by 8 sets of eyes, put inside a church vestibule by a man on an adjoining porch, and argued over by 6 attorneys for the state, and a defense team that needed her guilt in order to save its client. Her name had been in nearly every mouth that took the stand. She had not been in the room for most of it. She was asked 2 questions. She denied that there had been any intimacy between herself and Charles Hoover. She said that he had never made improper advances toward her. 2 answers, from behind a veil, delivered across a room from the man who had killed him. There was no cross-examination. The prosecution, which had spent a week fighting the picture of her that the defense was building, did not stand up. The defense, which had built it, had gotten what it needed from her presence and let her go. She stepped down, and the evidence closed. 95 witnesses, 2 questions. The book that gave Fletcher his 2 words, Shepard his vestibule, and the lawyer's 2 full days of speeches gave her appearance a few lines. Her exact words were not among them. So the one person who knew was asked twice and released, and 8 days of testimony about her conduct closed with a handful of sentences from her, none of which anyone bothered to write down exactly. Her daughters were 9 and 7. They were in New Albany while it went on, in the house at 5th and East Main with their grandmother, in a town where the trial was the only subject, and the papers carried it every day, at ages when children can read. Closing arguments took 2 days. Colonel Charles Jewett spoke for the defense, and he spent part of it on New Albany itself. He asked the jury not to wonder that a husband was the last man in town to hear what the town was saying. He knew of no place, he told them, where a greater number of competent persons can be found to attend to other people's business free of charge than New Albany. The men he was saying it to were New Albany. They had all read the paragraph. The defense's frame for the killing was not that it had been excusable. It was that it had been a public service. The shots on Market Street were described to the jury as proclamations of the sanctity of hearth, home and church all over this broad land, and the man who fired them was said to have shed blood in the highest defense of the state, because he had shed it in defense of marriage. The prosecution had the last word. It used it to talk about somebody who was not in the case. It told the jurors to go home to their own wives and children and tell them about the great trial and about the pleasure they had taken in reaching a verdict of not guilty, and it warned them what they would be writing that verdict with. A verdict of not guilty would go wherever the winds of heaven go, bearing sorrow and despair to a woman and 2 children who had done nothing. And then the sentence that turned out to be a forecast. You may liberate him, but he can only walk forth a free man over the prostrate form of his wife and amid the ruins of his children's home. The last thing the prosecutor asked was that the jury disregard the sentiment of the mob outside and remember its oath. The case went to the jury at 6:45 in the evening on the 9th of October. The room emptied out into the street. They were back in 15 minutes. By then, the courthouse and the streets around it were full, and when the verdict was read, the crowd made a noise the city had never heard before. The jury had acquitted Ira Strunk on the sole ground that he had been insane at the moment he did it. He was taken from the courthouse to the residence of Sheriff Loesch, and there he and the 12 men who had just tried him sat down and took tea together. After supper, the callers started arriving, and by the end of the evening, something on the order of 5,000 people had come by to congratulate him. The next day, a second jury was impaneled to decide whether he was insane now. It found that he was not, and he walked out into the town. That same day, Myra Strunk went to the depot with her mother and her 2 girls. She had told nobody in advance. The town that had spent 8 days deciding what she was found out that she was gone after she was gone. Ira Strunk got his position at the business college back. He took a house in Silver Hills, retired in 1907, went out to California, came home to New Albany in 1911, and lived on East Market Street until he died in December of 1937. He had said after the trial that he would get his daughters back at any cost, and there is no sign that he ever did. At Fairview Cemetery, he had bought 2 plots side by side. He was buried in one of them 51 years after the verdict. Myra was 35 years old when she went east. She had been born in that Pennsylvania town, and she had come out of it as a young woman with a good musical education, and she went back into it with 2 children, a widowed mother, and a name that 8 days of sworn testimony in Indiana had gone through line by line. The record follows her onto the train and stops. No date of death, no grave, not a word on whether she ever told the girls what had been said about their mother in the town where they were born.